Drive through Kentucky today, and you're likely to come across signs reading, "Welcome to the Front Porch of the South." Yet Kentucky has never been an easy state to define. During the Civil War, Kentucky straddled the line between North and South, gaining the somewhat generic classification of a border state. Yet there is a region that Kentucky at one point in time was most identified with, and it was neither the North or South. Join us today for a talk with a former research fellow who helps explain why Kentucky was considered to be part of the West and why that changed after the Civil War, as we explore the pages of Kentucky history with Kentucky Chronicles. Hi, I'm Daniel J. Burge, the Associate Editor of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, a scholarly journal and publication since 1903. I also coordinate our Research Fellows program, which supports researcher visits to our campus from around the world. Dr. Christopher Phillips is a John and Dorothy Hermanies Professor of American History and University Distinguished Professor in the Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at the University of Cincinnati. He holds a PhD from the University of Georgia. He has written numerous books, including Damned Yankee, The Life of Nathaniel Lyon, Freedom's Port, The African American Community of Baltimore, 1790 to 1860, and The Civil War in the Border South. We're talking today about his award-winning book, The Rivers Ran Backward, The Civil War and the Remaking of the American Middle Border. Welcome to the podcast. So we've had quite a few of our guests talk about the research process and what goes into writing a book, but I think The Rivers Ran Backward is the largest book we have discussed. As a historian, how do you begin a project like that? Do you start out knowing you're writing a large book, or does it start with a question and sort of grow somewhat organically from there?
Well, I don't know if I can speak to every book that I've written in that way, but this one started out much smaller than it ended. In part because the original question that I wanted to ask was far more targeted and focused. I wanted to understand how Kentucky became Southern. And that's not just a question of how Kentucky confederatized, but how then Kentucky post-confederatized. Mm-hmm. And so that was the beginning point. And when I began doing research, I found, I pretty much just focused on Kentucky to begin with. And then the more that I did, the more, the larger the story seemed to be. And it connected. It connected with a storyline that I knew fairly well by that point about Missouri during the war, and then after, and then it connected. It connected with other states, nearby states. And I remember at one moment, maybe the third or fourth year that I was into the research on the book, I just stopped for a moment and said, "How can you tell a story about a border if you only tell one side of the story?" Mm-hmm. You have to tell the story of both sides of the border. And that's when I realized it was going to be a much bigger book. And then the questions became somewhat bigger. And also the narrative lines became more complicated. But I think in the end, my thought was the right one, to understand this story from more than a state perspective, but rather a regional perspective.
I like that. It does help sort of pull everything together too when you approach a book. And as a reader, I was fascinated by how you're pulling in so many what could seem like different states, but then they all kind of mesh really well. And it's a really good look at Kentucky as well for our listeners.
Yeah, Kentucky is kind of the focal point of the book. But in the end, I decided that the focal point wasn't the exclusive point. Mm-hmm. And that in some sense, updating the Kentucky Civil War narrative, which I knew needed to be done, it was still pretty much static from the writings of E. Merton Colder, mm-hmm. and even a few other state historians since. I realized that it interpretively that we had a much more expansive panorama to try and tell this story the right way.
So before we get into the book itself, can you talk a little bit more about the research project? Once you had settled on the topic and you sort of knew where it was going, what archives did you end up visiting, and how does one know when is the for lack of a better term, the right time to start writing the actual book?
Boy, that's two really different questions, and I'm going to save the second one for, and maybe I can answer it in a way that that makes any sense whatsoever. And I'll just tackle the first one first. As far as the different research repositories that I went to, I was fortunate enough to get some good funding to begin the process, and I began it, as you might imagine, in Kentucky. I spent an entire summer going to the different Kentucky repositories, particularly in central Kentucky, and in particular UK and the Kentucky Historical Society. In fact, I was kind of one. I might have been the first scholar who used KHS when it pivoted to being a research repository as opposed to more genealogical. And things weren't cataloged. There really was no research catalog. It was a little bit frustrating, but what I found in both of those places was a richness of the research material that I never envisioned. In fact, I told several people that literally from the first document that I opened up nearly to the last, the story that unfolded told itself to me, and I realized it hadn't been told. It hadn't been told in the way that I kind of anticipated it, that Kentucky's and then ultimately Missouri's as well, pathway to southernness through the Civil War was not direct. It was indirect, and that there was a lot of revisionism that occurred after the fact, which didn't surprise me, but it surprised me the richness of the material that had never really been used. One of the reasons when I wrote the book that I included interstices, what I call interstices, some other people have called them vignettes, but they're more than that, that precede every chapter, was that I found such amazing collections that had their own narratives, that once you immerse yourself in those for any length of time, you realize there was a facet of the broader story that was being told in the family or in the collection that you're reading. And some of those collections were quite large and had never really been used in ways that I anticipated that they ought to have been. And so I said, I've got to tell these stories. These stories are self-contained. They tell an aspect of this broader narrative that that are vital to the story as a whole. Well, once I kind of finished at those two, then I broadened out and I did a number of other Kentucky repositories. And once I realized that the story at about the 2 or 3, and really that was after the National Archives, I had spent at least one summer there in the record group 393, which are the records of the Civil War that are filed by the commanders, and they were all collected into by year in these wonderful tri-folded documents. Once I had finished those, I realized this story was much bigger than what I had started out thinking, and I was going to have to go to other archives. And that's when I began broadening out and went to the different Missouri archives in Columbia and in St. Louis. And then I went to Illinois, and I went to Indiana, and I went to Ohio. And the irony of all of it is at the time when I started the project, I was living and teaching in Kansas. And then I got the job at Cincinnati. And then I knew that I could actually make use of the various repositories in this region: Western Reserve, Ohio Historical, Cincinnati Historical, all of these different places that could then deepen the research and also the documentation of this. And the irony of all of it is that my original idea about Kentucky's Southernization held true, because at the same time that Kentucky was undergoing this process, the states on the other side of the river were undergoing a similar process in inverse. They were northernizing, whereas before that there had been a much less stark divide. between the states north of the Ohio River and the states south in their politics over slavery. That's a product of the fact that the states themselves took on their own narratives and built them after the fact. And thus Kentucky becomes, as Ann Marshall said, and I thought that was one of the few things Ann said that wasn't quite right, is that Kentucky's always been a southern state. And my argument is, and my evidence suggested it had not. It had been a western state, similar to all those other states in this region.
I think that's a really good way of looking at it. I grew up in Maryland, so one of the things that I always found fascinating was that memory of okay, how do you see yourself as a region? So as a reader, when I'm reading this and it's going into, okay, here's sort of the West and here's how states start to see themselves. It's an interesting story that I think is applicable to a lot of different places. I think Kentuckians will find a lot to enjoy about the book, but also Ohio and Indiana and anyone who sort of identifies with this region.
I had done my dissertation on Maryland, on Baltimore actually, and so a lot of the ideas that were generated that became part of this book were from my first book, which was on Missouri during the Civil War period, and then my second book, which was on Baltimore, especially Baltimore's African American population in the antebellum period, which was not a war story because Barbara Fields had told that story already, but it packaged with that story by bringing it up to the war effort. So an awful lot of those ideas that found their way into this book percolated from those earlier projects, and then other projects that I did before I actually published this book.
Maryland just always fascinated me just growing up, because you do have those sort of like pockets where people would identify as Southern, and very much so still to this day would consider themselves Southerners. But then there were many regions within the state, including where I grew up, where there was sort of no even claim to a Southern identity. So moving to Kentucky, I sort of identified and somewhat understood. I think adding the West to all of that makes it even that much more interesting.
Right. And of course, we know, anybody who knows Maryland knows that it has like 4 subregions within it. And Baltimore's one of those subregions because it's so different than any of the others. But the Eastern Shore just defies all understanding because that is probably one of the most pronounced anti-union areas of the state during the war. And then Southern Maryland is, just by the very name Southern, it kind of identifies in that way. But the biggest plantations were, of course, on the Eastern Shore. And so it's a fascinating state, and it gives us a sense that there really probably, in all truth, there is no such thing as a state narrative in any state.
So to kind of play with that a little bit and getting more into the actual book itself, early in the book you write that the book helps explain, quote, how in their haste to make a fully formed sectional border divided by slavery, historians have largely ignored the centrality of Lincoln's home region, the West, to perhaps the war's most lasting outcome. So can you explain a little bit about the Middle West and what that region was or is?
Yeah, and it can start with names because the word Middle West really doesn't become a thing until the 1870s, and the word Midwest doesn't become a thing until the 1880s or 90s, or even after the turn of the century. Up until that moment, there was no such thing as the Middle West. There was the West. And the West was far more harmonious on these issues than we would expect because, of course, one of the things that has colored our understandings of this region is Lincoln. And that Lincoln starts in Kentucky, but he seems not to be in any way, shape, or form a Kentuckian. And then he's an Illinoisan, and so that makes it seem as if Illinois is all behind Lincoln and just like Lincoln. And just the nature of Lincoln's life, moving from being born in Kentucky and leaving Kentucky, largely because his economic opportunities, but those economic opportunities or the pursuit of them by his father were very much affected by slavery politics and slavery realities, meaning that he lost 2 really valuable pieces of land in court systems because of disputes over who actually owned the land or had first acquired it, and that itself was influenced by the nature of power that very much benefited slaveholders over non-slaveholders. And then he ends up in southern Indiana, which is, as a young boy, which is a deeply, deeply white and racist society, a society that really, in some sense, doesn't want slavery, but not because they believe in egalitarianism, but rather because they want to get away from a place like Kentucky that that has slaves and therefore has a black population, which they find, which they they want to get away from. And then he moves to Illinois, which by all measures is, other than New Jersey, probably the most racially prescriptive state in the entire country. A place where even Springfield is filled with Kentuckians who either are openly or overtly anti-black. And then you've got an entire section of Illinois and Indiana, the southern parts below about the National Road, that really undergo their own processes of trying to get slavery in despite the Northwest Ordinance. Illinois actually in 1821 or 1824 has a referendum on it, and to introduce slavery into Illinois, and they only lose by 1,800 votes or so. It's a place that we think we understand. We certainly apply Lincoln's legacy to it, the land of Lincoln, and yet it's a place we don't understand at all in that early period right up until about 1850. A place that was far more mixed, much more like Kentucky than we would assume, with the exception of slavery. And even there are these kind of, in Illinois, for example, in Indiana, there are these loopholes that allow slaveholders who have land in Kentucky to bring their slaves over and use them on their farms they own north of the Ohio River for a period of time. Illinois doesn't get rid of slavery until 1849, 1850, and it's done by the Supreme Court, not by the legislature. So again, this is a story that Illinois doesn't tell well because it doesn't really know how to tell it. Kentuckians, in some sense, tell the story of slavery in a very different way than other places, a more kind of a benign slavery, my old Kentucky home type of slave narrative. And Indiana and Ohio have done a pretty good job of not engaging with their own slave past in any way, shape, or form.
And I'll get to the question sort of on the reception of the book, because I think a lot of what you just touched on is talking about redoing or rethinking state histories, which of course is very important to us in Kentucky. But I'm curious, and I'll get back to this in just a little bit, how that plays a role in Ohio or Indiana, and sort of the reception to your book in those different regions. But as this is a Kentucky history podcast, I do have to ask this question. How does Kentucky fit into the story? What is sort of the thing that, if Kentuckians are interested in this book, mainly from looking at how we should be telling the state history or telling the story through the lens of Kentucky, how would you want them to see that? What do you sort of offer that's different from maybe some of the more traditional interpretations of this region or the state?
I have told, I've used this line several times when people have interviewed me or in talks when I get questions. The reason that the border matters and border states matter is that everything that the war began here in border states like Kentucky and Missouri. Now, Missouri has its own claim to that narrative, a more direct one, meaning that it experienced Bleeding Kansas. And Bleeding Kansas was, by most historians' estimation, it was a dress rehearsal for the Civil War. Kentucky, on the other hand, didn't have that more direct conflict period. But when the war actually comes, the first thing that we need to understand is that Kentuckians, Missourians, Illinoisans, Indianans, Ohioans did everything they could to avoid war because they found it reprehensible or unseemly to be fighting their neighbors. And so we've got states like Kentucky that the only state that by legislative act declares itself neutral. And that will put on record, to the Lincoln administration, you don't send your troops here. But of course they have to. Geographically, Kentucky is a vital strategic state, one that Lincoln says kind of in his own way, I'd like to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. He doesn't really say that, but he says something very much like it. And then he understands strategically he has to walk very carefully when it comes to Kentucky. But ultimately, the things that the war becomes, really important things, such as a hard war, meaning by the, somewhere, according to a lot of interpretations, somewhere by 1863, civilians become part of this narrative. Well, that's going on in 1861 in the border states, like Kentucky. Because civilians are very much part of the strategy of the Federal Army and the Confederate Army and the Confederate administration. They have to, in some sense, bring the war and civilians are not spared. Secondly, emancipation. Emancipation actually begins, the whole debate over emancipation begins because of the border states. Lincoln is mindful of this question of how to handle border states, neutral states like Kentucky. And Kentucky's kind of right in his center of his vision when it comes to that. He has to walk very carefully. On the one hand, he has to walk incredibly carefully when it comes to actual emancipation and a proclamation. And as we know, when he issues his proclamation in 1862, and the final version on January 1st, 1863, the border states are excluded from it. We also know that Lincoln allowed local commanders in Kentucky, like Ulysses S. Grant, William T. Sherman, a number of other commanders in this state. He gave them a long leash to bring a kind of warfare that would quell these kind of stay-at-home rebels, was the term that was used for them, people who hid behind neutrality and then used subversion, such as in Maryland, used subversion to try to and attack federal troops and to obstruct the federal war effort. Lincoln allows local commanders, who he says to them openly, you know best, so I'm going to let you handle what's going on the ground. He gives them a very long leash. And what occurs are, thousands of arrests of civilians who are then put into jails all over the place and held without a court date because habeas corpus was suspended in various places. Kentucky was among those places where habeas corpus was seen as expendable or revocable, and that it needed to be. Black enlistment. Black enlistment began actually particularly in Missouri, western Missouri, because many of those commanders out there who were very hardline, like James Lane, and who were also abolitionists, they made it a point of using military campaigns and movements to actually liberate slaves. And they did that specifically to punish slaveholding residents in those areas who they felt very strongly from being up close with them were resentful and even subversive against the federal government. And in particular, places where guerrilla activity was pronounced. That would be the fourth thing that began in these border states, is guerrilla warfare. We'll see it in West Virginia, we'll see it in Maryland, we'll see it in Kentucky, and we'll see it in Missouri, all beginning, and even in southern Illinois and southern Indiana to an extent. You'll see guerrilla warfare beginning to ramp up in these states before it ramped up in other places. And then lastly, perhaps the most important point of all of this is that the contest within the Federal Army between officers who supported emancipation and who opposed it will be most pointed and most toxic in these border states, in part because of policy, but also because of politics. And so people like Don Carlos Buell, for example, George B. McClellan, who begins in Cincinnati before he's moved east, these people will be very well known for their conservative policies. And the conservative policies meant that slavery or emancipation should not be part of the war effort. These people will be moved out of these states and replaced by Lincoln with commanders who are more sure on their politics, as they like to say, meaning they were more assuredly emancipationist and even abolitionist. All of that begins in this region. And then when those commanders will be moved to other theaters, and when the armies move from this theater or from these states and move further south, they will take what they've learned on the ground with them that will then evolve the federal military policies in front of them. So rather than seeing the hard war begin at the end of the war, we'll see the hard war beginning at the beginning and then being moved with the armies as they push south into the Confederacy.
It's almost as if our eyes have been focused on the wrong region to a certain extent, is the real sense I got from reading this. I mean, even as, a Marylander, you kind of do focus on Antietam, or you think about Gettysburg. You kind of focus on those events that are happening there. But I think the really enjoyable thing is you cause us to sort of shift our gaze out to Kentucky and to Indiana and to states like that.
That are having their own mini civil wars. And yes, I would agree with you. Our gaze has been focused on, in a Ken Burnsian way, the sort of broader pictures, the familiar characters, Virginia at the center of that narrative, Grant and Lee and some of these other very well-known commanders. What we didn't do very well was to look at their own genesises. Mm-hmm. And those genesises, with maybe the exception of Lee, almost exclusively began in these border states. It's where they cut their teeth on how the war actually would unfold and how they needed to direct the war in order to succeed and to win. And lastly, we focused our eyes so exclusively on Lincoln keeping his hands off the border states that I think it was a very easy and natural thing for many historians to say, well, the border states didn't matter because Lincoln kept his hands off of them. But in truth, when you scratch the surface just a bit, it doesn't take long to dig up the kind of very real traumatic war that border people faced, and that in turn influenced their retelling of those stories in a very grievance-filled way that would then lead to states like Kentucky and Missouri having their own Confederate renaissances after the fact, that they were always, as again Anne said, they were always Southern states, when in fact they were anything but.
You get a really good quote near the end of the book that I wrote down, that change starts at the margins, but it is completed in the middle. And that was a quote that really just hit me because I do think it's very apt. But it leads to a question. What have historians missed by ignoring or downplaying the West? Like, what have historians sort of overlooked? I think you've really outlined in that last question why it's important, but what have we sort of overlooked by ignoring this region or by not focusing on this region?
Well, one of the things we have, I think, overlooked is, and it seems to be kind of a bit of a fait accompli in most people's minds, that slavery was going to die, and that the West was going to be where it died, and therefore the Civil War was unnecessary. And that the border states didn't want to fight it, and we should have listened to them. And in many ways, their story was tragic because they got sucked into a broader war that ultimately was fought between others, people who kind of brought war to the West, and the West didn't want to participate in it. One, slavery wasn't dying. In fact, quite the contrary. It was growing specifically in these Western states. Even in Kentucky, it was growing leaps and bounds in the westernmost counties in the decade before the Civil War. Texas had the highest percentage of slave population growth of any state in the Union during the 1850s. It grew by 3.5 times. We can use approximations for Arkansas. We can use it had things gone differently in Kansas, much the same way. Western Missouri was where slavery was growing, and it's where, no surprise, some of the bitterest fighting in Missouri was found, particularly guerrilla fighting. Same for Kentucky. The western counties, the Purchase area, are known as the guerrilla counties, all the way up to Owensboro and Henderson. These were the places where slavery was actually growing in a state where in the 1850s overall, the slave population had stagnated. Not so much in Missouri. Overall, it's growing, it grows fairly substantially. Slavery is moving west, and it will not die of its own accord. In fact, quite the contrary, in many of those important benchmarks, political benchmarks about slavery in the territories, in the decade before the Civil War, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Compromise of 1850, the Dred Scott decision, et cetera, et cetera. Southerners won those congressional battles. They were all pro-slavery expansion. Every one of those rulings or decisions or legislations actually planted the seed for slavery to go farther west. Only in Kansas do we find it being arrested. And that, of course, redounds to the benefit of pro-slavery people in places like Missouri and Kentucky, saying, see, now we have known obstructionists, people like John Brown, people like those New Englanders, those immigrant aid people, who come out here specifically to usurp a national, natural, democratic process that they had come to understand was to benefit them if they supported slavery. And in this place, it doesn't work to their benefit. That makes them even more intent upon trying to win this battle for slavery. And lastly, these people in these states like Kentucky, they are actively involved in their own politics, a border war of a sort, particularly surrounding the fugitive slave law, that they are actively agents of their own change. And in Kentucky, particularly, what we see in the 1849 Constitution is an avowedly pro-slavery agenda and an outcome, meaning that slavery will be protected in this state at all hazards. And they put it on record and they vote for it in 1849, and it colors kind of how Kentuckians engage in that debate over the course of the 1850s. This will set them a little bit apart from their neighbors on the north side of the Ohio River. But there are still many of those people there who support the fugitive slave law, and they are actively promoting it, which means that Kentuckians may have their own border war, but they have accomplices. And those accomplices, many of them, live just on the north sides of the river. So again, we see these states mattering in understanding kind of the coming sectional crisis, and yet they are the last states to sectionalize. That should tell us something as well.
As we bring this to a close, I normally don't get a chance to ask this question, but I wanted to ask it because of the importance of the book, and that we've had a couple of years within the historical profession to digest it somewhat. Looking at how states have interpreted their own history, and especially of this very important era, do you think that the publication of the book has led to a shift in how people view the West, or changed perceptions as to the broader importance of places like Kentucky in the Civil War, or is this still part of sort of a broader process that you think will play out over the next decade? I know historical research is slow, so it can take a while, but...
Well, the old line is that you know the impact of a book 10 years after it's been published. If it's still being talked about 10 years after, then there's some resonance. It's made an impact. We're at the 8-year mark now with Rivers, and just the fact that we're having this conversation right now tells me it probably still has some shelf life, that it's in play still. That said, I don't know if the book had that impact, but certainly it was part of a whole series of books that have been written that show the contingency of what happened during that era, that things happened and that they triggered other things that happened, that there wasn't some kind of inevitability that the Civil War was going to come, or that slavery was going to end, or even that, and the more important point is a series of books have been written that have packaged with Rivers to talk about contingency, to make us realize that nothing was inevitable, that there was a kind of a chain reaction, things that would happen that led to other things happening, and that the border state was both part of that and also to some degree a part of it. That slavery was not inevitably going to die, but rather might have lasted another century for all we know, had the war not occurred. Books that, like Amy Morell's, that has told us that even emancipation was not an absolute, that it could go backwards, and that the pursuit of freedom was ongoing through the war and after. It wasn't something that miraculously occurred like some kind of a flu germ, despite the Emancipation Proclamation, and that the 13th Amendment was critical because of that. A number of really good books that have been written on the border states since I began working on the border states. I'll take a little credit for that, but I'll take a lot of credit for recognizing that this was a subject that just hadn't been addressed, not sufficiently, and that many people sort of took the E. Merton Colder view that the Kentucky was just like the rest of the South as gospel for 80 years. This corpus of literature, I think, probably more than one book, has led us to a new place, a place where, if you look at the scholarship now, that the absolutes are not as absolute, where there are distinctions made, and that state histories, and we haven't had real state histories appear of Kentucky and other states since this book came out. State histories will have to take into effect a number of these findings that people like me and other good historians like Ann Marshall and Amy Morell Taylor, all of them together have created a new paradigm. And that paradigm puts the border states at the center and not at the periphery of what the war was.
And that's one of the things we've really been trying to do with the podcast, but also with researchers who have been coming in to the Kentucky Historical Society, is to enable you all to tell those stories so that hopefully that next generation that comes along can pick up that narrative and start working those things into the broader state histories in places like Kentucky and other states as well.
I guess the irony of all of it was I was trained as a Southern historian in a very Southern program. And I remember when I was working on border states, I had people, faculty members ask me, among them Eugene Genovese, what are we going to learn from a place like Maryland or Kentucky? and my response was always, when I was told they weren't Southern states, I'd say, but they became Southern states. Mm-hmm. And I think that becoming now has been important to outreach like at KHS, to make people understand that we are a product of decisions and interpretations that we made long ago that build off one another, and that we can unwrite those wrong conclusions just as easily as they were wrongly written for very partisan and very political reasons.
It was always fascinating to me. I went to school to Alabama, and traveling to Alabama, it was so different in the sense of how they defined regions. I had never really seen myself as a Southerner, but if I had not thought of myself as a Southerner before I got there, they didn't even accept Virginia for the most part as being sort of part of the South. So it was sort of eye-opening for me how people identify, and I know that's a constantly shifting process. But even if you go to states like Georgia or Alabama, their perception of what the South is still, it's very different than a place like Kentucky.
One of my favorite stories is the summer I was in Lexington. I went out and took a break in the middle of the afternoon, and I grabbed a student newspaper. And about on the third page, there was an editorial or some kind of an op-ed that was written by somebody from Athens, Georgia, where I had done my degree. And he was in Kentucky, and he was talking about why Kentucky is not Southern and why Georgia is. And I remember just kind of stopping, saying, all right, we really have to get an answer to this question. And it's not weather, and it's not humidity, and it's not staple crops. It's
sweet tea.
It's sweet tea, right? Exactly. I think you may have mentioned sweet tea. That's not it. That's a kind of a cultural appendage to the reality that the South was made by the Civil War experience, and particularly afterwards, when a narrative, particularly in Kentucky, when they were not accepted by the North and they were not accepted by the South. And there was no longer a West that they understood in the same way that they did before the war. They had to find a place, and the place they found was by going to the South, by bridging that narrative of theirs to one that was more recognizably Southern. And that, in some sense, Kentucky's place in the Southeastern Conference and now Missouri's place in that conference were products of long political processes that packaged back to that search for meaning and grievance in the aftermath of the Civil War in places like Kentucky that, pardon the pun, that was orphaned because of that war.
I think that's a really good way to end this podcast. So thank you so much for joining us today. I know I've really enjoyed our conversation, and we appreciate your taking the time out of your day to do this.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
When Americans think of the West today, we conjure up images of saloons, cattle drives, and open landscapes. But as Dr. Phillips explained, how Americans identify themselves have shifted over time. If Kentuckians today are more likely to call themselves Southerners, this was not always the case. Perhaps we would do well to remember that one of Henry Clay's most notable nicknames was the Harry of the West. This brings another episode to a close. I would like to thank our guest, Dr. Christopher Phillips, for talking with me today. Kentucky Chronicles is funded by the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation. Our theme music is used courtesy of Pixabay. Our show is produced by Gregory Hardison, with support from Dr. Stephanie Lang.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm Dr. Stephanie Lang, editor of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society. The KHS Research Fellowship Program provides 1 to 4 weeks of funding for academic researchers whose projects focus on Kentucky or larger regional-related topics. Time periods are open. Researchers have used the KHS collections and archives to shed light on a vast array of topics, including resistance and slavery, politics, medical history and addiction, religion, activism, the early frontier, and environmentalism and economic development. KHS Fellowship applications are due soon, October the 1st. Daniel, tell them how they can learn more.
To learn more about our publication of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, or to learn more about our Research Fellows program, please visit our website, history.ky.gov. That's history.ky.gov. If you have enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe and be sure to tell your friends and colleagues.